push your back right there. So, hi, I'm Connor Arthur. I'm a student at Lake Washington High School, and today I'm going to be presenting to you the history of France from the 900s till 1453. So, this right here, yeah, this is going to be another multi-parter. So this right here is the original ancient flag of France. I guess it's the royal standard, which it displays the arms of the king. Originally it was the Capetian house, and then it had the cadet range. We'll talk about it, but it's the symbol of the fleur-de-lis on a blue background. So right now, the first thing that we need to talk about regarding the history of France is West Francia, or the earliest thing that resembles modern France. Earlier, you had the Gauls, and then the Gauls became overran by Germanic invaders called the Franks, who set up their own kingdom.
What is the Gauls?
The Gauls were a collection of Celtic tribes that lived in the area of France, and they became conquered by the Romans, and they got Latinized. They started speaking vulgar Latin, which is what became the basis of the French language, is Latin.
Right.
And then they had a Germanic invasion during the ending period of the Roman Empire. Okay, thanks for closing the door. With the Germanic invasion of the Franks, who became the overlords of the Gauls, they had a linguistic diversion where the French language where Gallo-Romance became progressively Germanized, which is how French diverged from other Romance languages like Spanish or Italian. You know, French sounds very different from Spanish or Italian because of the different influences on it over the centuries. So the Frankish kingdom under Charlemagne, who we talked about last time in the Germany presentation, Charles the Great was the king of West Francia, who conquered territory in the east. He conquered the Saxons and expanded the Frankish realm, and he rebuilt the Roman Empire when he was crowned in the year 800, on Christmas Day by the Pope, creating the Holy Roman Empire. But with Charlemagne's death, his realm became partitioned into three parts. There was West Francia, which once again became the Frankish kingdom. There was Middle Francia, which became Lotharingia. And then there was East Francia, which became Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire. So the West Francians, spoke the Latin that had devolved significantly, the vulgar Latin. It was not the classical Latin, the written Latin that we think about when we think of the Latin language, or the language of the educated Romans like Cicero, Livy, Pompey, all of them. They spoke a language that was almost completely different from the common Latin, which was like the vulgar speech of common-born Romans as compared to the educated written version of Latin. So this common version of Latin evolved into Gallo-Romance, which is what became French later. So with the Treaty of Verdun, which is what split up the Frankish realm, West Francia came under the rule of Charlemagne's firstborn son, Charles the Bald. Yes, he was called Charles the Bald because he was bald. Yeah.
That was my next question.
However, the Carolingian house eventually became extinct after a couple more kings. And with the extinction of the descendants of Charlemagne, Charles the Great, there needed to be a new king. So they had an election to determine what the next ruling house of West Francia would be. So Louis V was the final Carolingian monarch, and Hugh Capet, who was Capet. There's so many pronunciations I'm gonna totally butcher. I can't ever get it right. Well, anyway, he became elected the king. He was a very popular choice among the nobles. And the senior Capetian line would last until 1328. And then it would be the final living heir, Joan II of Navarre. She died, ending the direct line, the direct descendants of Hugh Capet. And then they had two cadet branches. They had the Orleans, who took over the throne. They became the senior line, and several junior lines, including the Valois, and then of course, I'm trying to think of the other one. Orleans, House of Orleans. And they ruled over different parts of France instead of France, the royal title. So the Bourbon House would be immensely influential throughout France and the world in the coming centuries, due to things like the French Overseas Empire and the French Wars of Expansion. So now I need to talk about the emergence of France as opposed to West Francia or the Frankish Kingdom. So in the late 900s, the term France as opposed to West Francia began to be used, mostly to distinguish itself from East Francia and Lotharingia, which I have a map here, eventually. Come on now. Yeah, so I have a map here. So this is France right here, and then everything in the middle here is Lotharingia, which used to be its own kingdom, but Lotharingia disintegrated over the centuries as parts of it got conquered by France and Germany, and it became split up due to inheritance and all of these things. And eventually Lotharingia kind of ceased to exist, and then everything east of that is Germany, and we don't care about Germany in this presentation. We've done enough talking about them.
Didn't it get split up because Charlemagne gave...
He had 3 sons. He gave them all a kingdom.
Yes.
But Lothair also got the kingdom of Italy.
That's right.
So the kingdom of Italy and Lotharingia were united in the person of Lothair, but he did not have both of them. I mean he did have both of them, sorry, but they were separate kingdoms, and they're separate nobility institutions and all of that. So around the year 1000, the change from West Francia and Frankish kingdom to simply France, or Kingdom of France, was complete. And the Frankish kingdom became an archaic or formal way to refer to the French. And this banner over here is called the Oriflamme. I probably pronounced that wrong. But it was the banner of Saint Denis, and it was supposedly, we don't know, it's a very ancient artifact. But it was used as the battle standard of the kings of France. So this is also another one of the maybe earliest things that could be construed as a French national flag. But not really. The concept of a national flag didn't really arise until the 19th century. Yeah, it took a while for countries to adopt one flag that was considered to be the national flag as opposed to the personal flag of a monarch or something else. So the emergence of the different languages, because France has 2 major linguistic groups, and this might be a surprise to people who only think about the main French language, which is actually just the Parisian dialect. There are several other languages that exist, or really used to exist in France, before the ascendancy of the Parisian dialect. So Latin languages, like I had mentioned earlier, have been spoken in Gaul since the Roman conquest in 50 BC. When Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, he subjected the Gauls to Romanization. So the Latin languages were, however, that were introduced into France, or Gaul, or West France, or whatever the heck this region is called, there's so many names for it, was, of course, like I had mentioned, it was the language of the Roman commoners. And over the centuries, Gallo-Romance diverged into 2 types. There was the oil languages, which were in the north, and these 2 names are dependent on what the word for yes was. So in the northern languages, the word to say yes is oil, or we evolved into we. But in the Middle Ages, it was usually oil. These Italian, I can't with these languages. And then in the south they had the Oc languages, and you say Oc to say yes. No. Actually, it was the northern languages that were more influenced by Germanic vocabulary, and the southern ones were more influenced by Romance vocabulary and pronunciation. So these 2 different languages diverged so much from each other that they were basically not mutually intelligible from each other. It would be like trying to speak Spanish to a French person. They can't really, might be able to pick out 1 or 2 things, but overall it's gibberish to either of them. So northern France and southern France evolved into 2 separate societies, really, based on this language division. And then of course, Paris was the capital, so the Parisian dialect became the most prestigious one, the one that more people would try to speak. So eventually, the southern languages, the Provençal variety, would be on the decline. So by 1500, the Oc languages were going into severe decline. And Parisian had basically taken over everything, at least in the educated sphere, in the noble sphere, in France, pretty much by 1500. So, and by the 20th century, common people speaking the Oc languages had basically totally ended, except for in a couple places. And today, the Oc languages still exist, but people are usually bilingual in it with regular French, and it's more of a...
Would those be Basque and?
No, Basque is completely different. I'll have to talk about the Basques later, but basically Basque is actually a pre-Indo-European language. So we gotta go all the way back into the ancient times to talk about what the difference between an Indo-European language and a non-Indo... Okay. Basque is weird. It is not French. Basque is not French.
There's nothing like Basque. Basque is Basque.
Basques only know Basque.
Most closely to Hungary in the country.
No, Basque is actually a complete language isolate. There are no other languages that resemble Basque at all.
Oh, so it's not an Oc.
No. So in the north here, we have the oil region, and then in the south, we have the Oc region.
Yeah, Languedoc.
Yeah, you know.
And I've heard Languedoc, but I've never heard of Languedoc.
No, that's mostly just because these just evolved into the modern French language. It's these that are the weirdo exception.
Okay.
So the government of medieval France was not centralized by any measure. France relied on an economic and political system called feudalism, where the king gave grants of land to the lords, who ruled the lands in the name of the king, and then they had their own vassals. So they had dukes who had counts as vassals, who had barons as vassals, who had knights as vassals. And they all provided taxes and military service to each other, going all the way up to the king.
What year are you talking about?
This is a general statement about medieval France from the 900s to the 1500s. Feudalism lasted a very long time in France, and there's quite a bit of debate among historians of whether feudalism is even an appropriate construct to view the political and economic system of medieval France in. It's a whole...
What would it be if it wasn't feudalism?
I can't tell you. I'm a feudalism supporter, so the arguments of the people who think feudalism is bogus, I don't get them.
Yeah.
It was very much a formal thing. So much of the regions of France were divided into fiefs, and only the Paris and the surrounding area, which was called the Ile de France, which means the island of France, because it was like a little... I've heard it pronounced the other way, but whatever. I'm very sorry in advance. And it was crown land held directly by the king. Everything else, that was up to the vassals. The king had very limited authority in lands he didn't hold. So the dukes, I already mentioned how feudalism kind of worked. And then underneath all of the nobles, you had serfs, who were people... Serfdom is not slavery. Serfdom means that essentially you have a contractual agreement to live in a certain... So what serfdom... Okay. So serfs are people who are required to live and work on a specific piece of land through a contractual agreement with the Lord. And the contractual agreement with the Lord says, all right, I will protect you from bandits and anybody who wants to attack you or anything, from people robbing you, but you have to live on my lands and work on them. But the serf can't move or terminate the agreement.
Oh.
But he does have the protection. Free men or peasants who are able to move don't have as many privileges as serfs. So you win some, you lose some, right? So, and the serfs can become free men can become serfs. People move back and forth between these types of arrangements.
Didn't the serfs have to give most of their product or what they grew to the Lord?
Okay, so the tax rate was not a constant thing. It was dependent on who is your lord, and what time. But usually it was about 10% of your income, which is pretty generous compared to the tax rates we suffer today in the modern world. So basically, that's kind of feudalism in like 2 minutes.
You should point out that, I mean, they're subsistence farmers.
Yeah, they didn't have,
You give them more than 10%, they would starve.
medieval people relied on their own work to feed them, unless they were tradesmen, in which they used the money they earned from their trade to buy food.
You need a lot of serfs to give you money.
Yeah. So basically, if you were forced to give more than 10% of what you made, you know, that's not a sustainable thing. So we have a diagram here to visually explain feudalism. So up here we have the Pope, who was really all the kings were vassals of the Pope. You know, so at least in theory, the monarchs were responsible to aid the Pope whenever they were asked to. This didn't usually happen. It was chaotic, at
Like
least.
the Crusades.
Yes, the Crusades. When we're going to talk about the Crusades. So then the monarch, he has his lords, and then they have their knights, and then they have the common people, the merchants, the craftsmen, and the farmers, and the peasants, and the serfs, and all of the others. And you see, they provide food and services, and then they provide service to them, and they provide service to him. And in turn, he provides land, they provide land, and also protection. So it's an I scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of arrangement.
Which worked pretty well.
Yeah, it was actually pretty functional. It was only when the lords and also the urban bourgeois classes started to try and undermine feudalism to increase their own power at everyone else's expense.
It lasted 10 times longer in our current economy.
Yeah. So compared to present economics, feudalism actually sounds kind of stable. So we have a map of France here again. So as you can see, pretty much the only thing that the king actually held is the Paris. Everything else, that's a vassal. So you have all the different fiefs. You have Normandy, which the royal dynasty of England originally, after the Norman conquest, were the Dukes of Normandy who went to Britain to assert their claim on the English throne. And then you have Brittany, which at times Brittany is a very different region from the rest of France because they have a lot of Celtic influence from Britons who fled. So Celtic Britons, before the English arrived in Britain, because the English are actually Germanic tribes who migrated to Britain. The original inhabitants of Britain are Celtic Britons, and the Celtic Britons who remained in Britain became the Welsh. But some of them fled the English conquest and went to Brittany, which is why Brittany still has a lot of Celtic influence, and also some people still speak the Celtic language despite Paris's best efforts to convince everyone to speak Parisian.
Also go to Ireland.
Well, yeah, Ireland was already Celtic. I don't know if there was a massive migration of Britons to Ireland, but you know, it was split up into a bunch of fiefs. That's basically all you gotta know about this. Well, actually, hold on.
How is it different from the duchies in Germany?
Oh, okay. So the imperial estates of Germany and the French fiefs were different because the king actually had a lot more authority in France compared to the emperor in Germany. Germany's political system was heavily based on rights and privileges that couldn't be infringed. You know, free and imperial cities and other kinds of territorial privileges.
That's the best way to say it. They were free cities in Germany.
That's just one example of the different political arrangements. But in Germany, things were a lot more based on local privileges. France, it was heavily based on the persons of the lords themselves. It was a highly personal political system as opposed to an institutional one.
So they started from a common base, right? So
They were both the Frankish Empire, and then the Frankish Empire got partitioned, and then they diverged from each other. So as you can see over here, we've got Germany, and the border gore. It's not good. If you could get up close, you can see that the imperial territories have all kinds of weird border shapes and exclaves inside of each other, and all of these things. which we went over last time in the Germany presentation. You remember the really terrible looking borders.
There you have Lorraine on the east side of the.
Oh yeah, Lorraine went back and forth. It was originally, of course, Lotharingia. That's where the name Lorraine comes from. But as Lotharingia became disintegrated, destroyed, absorbed into the two giants crashing down on them from either side, Lorraine, Luxembourg, and the Low Countries, and Burgundy itself went back and forth between lordship of France or the emperor, whichever one they felt like at the time, really.
Really, when you think about Charlemagne, when he created Lotharingia, he created a battle zone that would last for 1,000 years. Where they just fought back and forth between all his descendants for centuries.
Yeah. Originally, it was meant to serve as a wall separating the two of them so they wouldn't fight. But, you know, that didn't stop them.
That didn't work.
Well, Lotharingia, I guess, just wasn't strong enough. So now we need to talk about the Crusades. So, the Crusades need a little bit of context. Otherwise, they look like how you've been told to view them, of this act of random Christian aggression against the peaceful Muslims. But that's not really the story. Because when Islam arose in the 7th century, their first target was the Christian Byzantine Empire, the Greek Empire. And with the rapid expansion of Islam eating up the entire Middle East for breakfast, Christians had a very good reason to be mad about this Islamic territorial expansion. So, eventually, the Pope was like, so it was the Byzantine Emperor, Manuel II. He was like, hey, we need to do something about these people who are eating our empire for breakfast. How about we call the Pope, even though we kind of have bad relations with him, due to that whole Great Schism thing. And basically what happened was, you don't want me to... they didn't like the Pope, but they were like, you know what, we need to appeal to the Pope because maybe he can help us.
Christians himself, Christians.
Yeah, that was the whole thing. So basically they asked the Pope, and the Pope said, all right, we will go over to the east to defend you against the Muslims. He made a speech at the Council of Clermont in 1097, this is in 1097, urging the Christian warriors to journey to the east and liberate the Eastern Christians from their Muslim conquerors. So in 1097, Pope Urban II declared the First Crusade. This is a little bit after the speech at the Council of Clermont. Same year though, and it was a military campaign to liberate the Byzantine Empire from the Islamic conquest. So also the Christians who were living in the Muslim Caliphate in the Middle East were subjected to a lot of bad things. So they had to pay a tax for not being Muslim. It's called the jizya. And also they were just treated as second-class citizens for not being Muslim. So obviously Christians living in Christian countries were like, hey, we need to go there and help them because, letting them continue to live like that reflects badly on us. The Crusaders passed through Europe on their way to the Holy Land. They picked up a lot of peasants who wanted to join the crusade because everybody was really, really excited about this whole thing. Even common people were getting in on the action, and they were like, you know what, I want to go over there and help. But they didn't own any weapons, so they didn't really think the whole thing through. So basically, when a lot of these Crusader armies carrying all of these random people who had joined got to the Middle East, there was a bloodbath. A lot of unarmed peasants died, which was very disappointing. But Godfrey of Bouillon, Urban II, okay, so some of the leaders of the Crusades, these are very famous names. Godfrey of Bouillon, he was a French lord. Urban II, he was the Pope. Peter the Hermit was a French monk who led a bunch of these poor peasants and stuff into the Crusades. But also he picked up a couple of other people, his crusade wasn't super successful, but it was the first one to actually reach the Holy Land. So, but no, Peter the Hermit, I think he lived, so it was alright. But then the other lords got involved, and that's when things really started picking up. Bohemond of Taranto, he was a Norman lord in Italy, so he was Italian. Raymond IV of Toulouse, another Frenchman. Adhemar of Lipui, he was French. Robert Curthose, he was English. Stephen of Blois, he was French. Hugh of Vermandois, French. And Robert II of Flanders, he was, well, Flanders is Flanders. Flemish, yeah. And then also another guy who was a major player in the Crusades, his name was Hugues de Payens, and he founded the Knights Templar, who we're going to talk about in a little minute. So, the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the other Crusader states got established as a result of the First Crusade. The First Crusade was an incredible success. They pretty much liberated the entire Middle East in one go. They also created the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Principality of Edessa. I think that's what it was. The counties of Tripoli and Edessa, sorry. And also the Muslim civilians in these lands that had been reconquered by the Crusaders, they weren't slaughtered or anything, they were just left alone. To the best of their, obviously there were some isolated incidents of, people not being super great, to put it lightly, but overall there was a general policy to just leave the civilians undisturbed in the Crusades. So this is Peter the Hermit. Like I mentioned him earlier, he was a friar. And this is not a contemporaneous depiction. I think this is from a medieval manuscript published a couple centuries after his death, but that's what he probably looked like. He was a friar, so. And then he had his knights following him. He picked up a lot of knights on the Crusades on his way over there. So it wasn't like he was bringing only peasants. He picked up a lot of poor knights and other nobles who weren't big name lords like the ones we just mentioned, but they were capable warriors. So this is a map of the Crusader states. So right here, the biggest one is the Kingdom of Jerusalem. This was kind of the main Crusader state, and it was founded mostly by French lords, and most of these were actually founded by French lords. French people made up the majority of the Crusaders. They were the ones who were really the most interested in the whole adventure. The County of Tripoli, Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the Kingdom of Lesser Armenia, also called the Kingdom of Cilician Armenia. And why is it Armenia? Well, Armenia had a very special role to play in the Crusades. So with the expansion of Islam, Armenia was a Christian kingdom buried in a sea of Islam. Armenia was actually the first Christian country, the first country to convert entirely to Christianity. But with the Muslim invasion, the Turks came into Armenia and expelled a lot of Armenians from their homelands. So they had to venture west, and they went to Cilicia, which is in what is now Turkey. They established a new Armenian kingdom there, and with the help of the Crusaders.
Is that why part of Jerusalem, they kept talking about Armenia?
No, Armenians in Jerusalem arose from a completely different set of circumstances. There was an Armenian community in Jerusalem for centuries before the Crusades. It was just that Jerusalem was one of the major cities of the Middle East, so it had a very cosmopolitan demographic. There was a lot of people from a lot of different countries living in Jerusalem. So, in 1190, after the First Crusade, a new religious order got created. It was called the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ in the Temple of Solomon. But you might know them as the Knights Templar. And they were a military order dedicated to the defense of Christianity against all threats. So this order, I mentioned that. So they were not only warriors, but they were also masters of finance. So they created banking, this radical new invention. Well, it wasn't a new invention, but they perfected it, really. So they created a system where pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land would be able to give their money to the Templars at a Templar chapter house, and they would get a piece of paper. It was like a check. Basically, they invented the check. And they would go to the Holy Land and be able to withdraw it at another Templar chapter house. But if you were going to get robbed on the way there, that piece of paper is useless to somebody trying to steal it from you, because you're not that person,
They were kind of the first Western Union. You could go somewhere else and bring your money over without alcohol.
So other orders of knighthood got founded also. The Knights Hospitaller, who were founded to create hospitals. And they still exist. They're called the Sovereign Military Order of Malta now. But I can talk about them later. They're very interesting. The Teutonic Knights, who were founded to really do the Northern Crusades, who we talked about last time in the Germany presentation. They weren't nearly as involved in the struggles in the Holy Land as much as the Knights Templar. And they also kind of maybe sort of still exist. They exist as a religious organization in the Catholic Church. They're not a military order anymore, unfortunately. And the Knights of St. Lazarus, who were founded to create leper hospitals for people suffering from leprosy.
Oh, the leper.
Yeah. And the Knights of St. Lazarus don't exist as an organization anymore, but they got turned into a chivalric order called the Knights of St. Maurice and Lazarus, which exists as it existed as a order of chivalry, which it was a decoration for Catholic noblemen, but it's not an organization anymore. That like does leper hospitals. We don't really have leper hospitals anymore. The Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, which still exist as an order, not as a military one. And the Knights of Santiago, or the Knights of St. James the Great, who instead of going to the Holy Land, they fought to liberate Spain from the Moors. Because Spain also became conquered by Muslims. So the Christians also in the Crusades, a lot of them went to Iberia in the west to fight against the Moors. So the Knights Templar were brought down, however, in an elaborate conspiracy by people who owed them money, especially the King of France, actually, which was pretty, embarrassing for the King of France to go against the Knights Templar, but he owed them a lot of money, so he wanted them to get out of the way. So they falsely accused the Knights Templar of devil worship and got them disbanded.
That's where they came from.
Yeah. So it was really just because the Knights Templar were getting too into that banking stuff. And the King of France owed them a lot of money. So here we have a picture of some of the knightly orders. We have, of course, the Knights Templar, Order of the Holy Sepulchre, Knights Hospitaller, the Teutonic Knights, and the Knights of Santiago, who were all Spanish. And yeah, they formed a significant amount of the fighting forces of the Crusades. So in addition to the forces brought by lords with them to the Middle East, it was also the Crusader orders who operated as their own forces in the Middle East.
This is just my own question. The knights, were they just like normal people who put on the costume of the knight?
No, so a knight was a social status. It was a job. Like, you were brought up to become a knight. So a knight starts out as a squire who works for another knight, and then when you're actually around my age is when you're 17. It was my birthday like 2 days ago, by the way. Yeah. Usually when he was reaching his adulthood, he would receive the accolade, which is the ceremony where he bends down on one knee and he put the sword over his shoulders, and he said, "I know you as Sir, whatever your name is." And that's when a squire becomes a knight. So a knight chooses his squire who becomes his successor.
They were usually younger children of the nobility.
Yes. However, there were commoners who were able to become knighted, but it was very rare that a lord would choose a commoner to become his squire.
Any knight can make another knight, and so they treated that as an internal move. Think of it kind of like the merchant class. You had to get into the merchant class and stay in the merchant class. Same thing with the knights. Once you got into the knights, you stayed with the knights.
Did you get married in the knights?
So knights, so there were two types of knights. There were secular knights, who are knights who were vassals of a lord, and then there were the religious knights, like members of the Knights Templar. And religious knights had to take on vows, like a monk or a nun, but no, there weren't any female knights.
They were semi-priests.
They were not priests. Knights could not become priests.
They weren't priests, but they were semi.
They were religious. Religious is a different category from priests. So they had to take on vows of celibacy. A member of the Knights Templar could not be married because he had to dedicate his life to the order, to the military mission of defending Christianity rather than having a family. So, and to become a member of the Knights Templar, you had to be a knight already. They didn't make knights. You had to be a knight who was a vassal of the lord, and then you had to ask your lord if it would be okay for you to join the Knights Templar. and stuff. So it was a whole thing. And this applies to all of the other orders as well. They were all based on the Knights Templar. They all founded each other on the model of the Knights Templar. So basically, knighthood was an occupation and a social class, and it wasn't just any old person.
The Crusader Knights, they formed as a result of the calling for the
They were founded as a result of the military peril of the Christians in the East. So, what was I talking about? So regular people who became soldiers, they were not called knights. A knight was distinguished not only by his armor, because a knight is the only in order to be able to afford the weaponry of a knight, you had to be a noble. Basically, you had to have money. Common people who became warriors usually had other types of names to describe them. So there were sergeants, actually. You might think of sergeant as a military rank that ranks above a common soldier nowadays in modern militaries, but sergeant actually comes from the word servant. And sergeants were common people who had been made into soldiers by lords or other knights, or by knights, to follow them around and form part of their retinue. So Crusader sergeants were common people who had been given their weapons by a lord. They didn't own their weaponry. It was on loan to them.
It's the same way. They started as a non-commissioned officer. They can't be officers. Back then, the knights were their officers. Sergeants were the guys who took care of the regular troops.
Yeah, and then below them, they just had regular people. They didn't get a job title. They were just soldiers.
Right.
Yeah, private soldier, sure. So the later Crusades, they kind of dropped off. They weren't as effective. They were mixed. Some of them, so when the Muslims had captured Jerusalem once, there were some of the Crusades managed to recapture Jerusalem and they lost it again. It went back and forth a lot. So one of the more important Crusades that wasn't nearly as effective was the Third Crusade. So Jerusalem had fallen after the Second Crusade, and Richard the Lionheart of England, he was the King of England, asked the Pope to call a crusade to retake Jerusalem. Now they didn't manage to retake Jerusalem, but they did keep themselves from losing more land. So it was really just a battle to stay after the first one. What?
Is it Richard III?
Yes. Yeah.
He's the one who's...
He's famous for being a Crusader king.
Oh, they found him in the parking lot at the...
What?
In England, they found his...
Wait, what?
The Volker was in a parking lot?
Yeah.
Well, in an area that later, I guess, became a parking lot. I didn't know that they...
Parking lot then.
No, they didn't have cars.
No, this was... You didn't read that? I mean, this was...
I have not heard of that. I didn't know about that.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
That's really interesting.
5 years ago, maybe, something like that.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Oh, I would have thought we would have known where we buried our kings.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the German king, German emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, he went over to the Middle East for the crusade, the Third Crusade, but he drowned in the Salep River in 1190. That was not super great. That was a huge loss to the Crusaders, because Frederick was actually an amazing king back home in Germany, and losing him in the Middle East was a huge blow to the Crusader morale. So they lost more and more land, and then the Fourth Crusade was called, and this one was a total disaster. I'll talk about that on the next slide. And in 1291, a little bit later, basically they had lost everything except for Acre, which is this little town, it's a city on the coast of the Middle East in the north, up by Turkey. It's near Turkey nowadays. Turkey wasn't a thing back then. The Turks had only started invading Anatolia in the 1100s. Yeah, so originally what is now Turkey was populated entirely by Armenians and Greek people. And then the Turks came in and through processes of genocide and expulsion, replaced the native Greeks and Armenians with Turks. And this process would be consolidated after World War I, but with the Turkish and Greek population exchange of 1923, when Turkey and Greece where Turkey agreed to send all of the Greeks who lived in Anatolia, those of them that were left, all the way to Greece, across the Aegean Sea, completing the centuries-long Turkish conquest of Anatolia. That's a whole, we'll talk about it later probably, but that's just, you know, a thing. Turkey isn't natural. It's not a natural thing. It's a result of medieval conquests.
Kind of like Israel.
Yeah.
Today.
Yeah. So, anyway, let's talk about the Fourth Crusade and why it was a total disaster. So, the European Knights wanted another crusade in 1202, and they were like, hey, like, you know, maybe we should actually, like, maybe it'll work this time. You know, so everything was going really well, and they were actually planning to attack Egypt because it was the seat of power for the Ayyubid dynasty, which was the dynasty in charge of the Egyptian Caliphate at that time. So they asked Venice to help them build a fleet because Venice, you know, the Venetians were renowned shipbuilders, or seafarers. So the Crusaders only had about 10,000 men, and the fleet had more ships than they actually needed. So they ordered the wrong amount of ships, I guess. I don't know. It was just first of many of a long series of mistakes with this one.
Well, you got to remember, Crusades were big money, right? Most of those feudal lords lived off the money they were paid by their lord for going on crusades. So they always wanted to go on a crusade. That's how they made a living, right?
Yeah. It was how they got money. So Venice said, sure, we'll make you pay less for the fleet, because they were like, hey, we can't afford all these ships, so we need to like pay less. And then Venice says, sure, we'll make you pay less if you help us attack Zara. Why is this important? So Zara is a city located on the eastern shore of the Adriatic, across from Venice, that had left Venice and joined Hungary, because they didn't like how Venice was treating them. So the Crusaders didn't want to attack fellow Catholics, so they decided, you know what, well, we can't go and attack the Muslims if we don't do this one little errand, so they did. And then Venice got excommunicated for this.
So they started a crusade by attacking the Christian kingdom.
Yeah, it was not good, just bad. The Fourth Crusade is basically the reason why the Crusades totally dropped off and didn't work anymore. So, let's introduce Isaac of Byzantium. So he's a prince who thought himself to be the legitimate emperor of the Byzantine Empire. So he asked the Crusaders to help restore him to his rightful throne. And the Crusaders supported him so that Byzantium would help them. So the Crusaders attacked Constantinople to install Isaac. They also wanted money. So they waited to get paid. And while they were waiting to get paid, eventually they just said, fine, if you're not going to pay us, let's sack Constantinople. So then they sacked Constantinople. Boy, no Muslims attacked yet, only Christians. What the heck? So after completely destroying the Byzantine Empire and basically destroying Constantinople, they created the Latin Empire, which was a successor state of the Byzantine Empire, but ruled over by the Latin lords.
So think about this. The Crusades were started to save Byzantium, and they ended by destroying the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah, it was so then, also...
Wasn't the Pope supposed to be orchestrated on this?
Okay, so the Pope was, but he couldn't. He's too far away to effect events immediately. Because you gotta think, the orders traveled by ship, and then also you've got hungry crusaders waiting in Constantinople for money. It was really inevitable that was gonna happen.
This is no longer Urban, right?
No, Urban had been dead for a long time. This is in 1202, so...
This is 200 years this is going on.
200 years later, after the First Crusade.
So the Pope's kind of lost interest. But,
No.
well, they weren't supporting it like they were originally. But now you have these knight groups that are making a lot of money doing this, and they're very rich.
Yeah. So basically, the Byzantine Empire gets totally destroyed. It gets split up into the Roman Empire of Nicaea, which is the Greek one, and it exists in Anatolia, and its capital is Nicaea. And then the Latin Empire, which is in basically Greece, with its capital is Constantinople, and they fought each other, but eventually Nicaea won and reconquered the Byzantine Empire, and it lasted until 1453, which is the year this presentation ends.
And we sing about it. We sing about it. Take me back to Constantinople. There's a song.
Oh, yes, the song, yeah. You can't go back to Constantinople. Okay, so the reason, the name change from Constantinople to Istanbul was a gradual one. It wasn't, so when the Turks had conquered Constantinople, they didn't actually change the name immediately, because they had too much respect for Constantine. They actually thought Constantine was pretty cool guy. They respected him for being a cool Roman emperor. So the Turks, actually, they called it Constantiniye, and not Constantinople. And then, eventually, more and more people started to call it Istanbul, because they're like, I don't know about Constantine. Let's, call it something else. And then the name change became official, actually, after World War I, with the creation of Turkey, modern Turkey, not the Ottoman Empire.
Do you know where the name Istanbul came from?
Yeah, it's called it means the city of Islam.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. That's the ultimate L to the Turks right there is, wow, we captured your capital city and renamed it to the city of Islam.
But it was never official till post-World War I.
Yeah, it was never an official name until after World War I. So, with Ataturk being super Turkish nationalist and trying to change everything in Anatolia to be Turkish and not Greek. Which is also what he resulted in doing the ethnic cleansing against Greek people. So, there's that. So now we're going to pivot over to talking about daily life in the Middle Ages, because a lot of people have some very weird misconceptions they get from watching all these movies depicting medieval people as smelly and dumb and all of this. So medieval people bathed and had hygiene. They weren't dirty all the time. Being dirty for them was just as uncomfortable as being dirty is for us. If you get, mud all over, you're going to want to clean yourself off. It's not like you can just ignore it. So they bathed, but obviously they didn't have running water, so they had to get all their bathing water from wells, which filling up a bathtub took a while, but they did it. They did reuse bathing water for multiple people sometimes in the family. It was a thing. So if you were the fourth person to bathe, your water might have been a little dirty, but that's just how it had to be, They hadn't had running water since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, so yeah. Bath houses existed in cities. In all of the major European towns and cities, they would have a bathhouse. Usually it was actually a Roman one that they had just kept using and made additions onto. And these bathhouses used to be really popular until this thing happened called the Black Death. And everybody's died of the plague. So then they're like, maybe bathing in public water with each other, that's how you get the plague. So then bathhouses fell into disuse.
Funny part is they bathed more. If they used the common bathhouses more, they'd have less plague.
No, because
that was transfer of fleas, and they killed.
Oh well, okay, but people were getting sick by being near each other. Just like this other disease you might have heard of called
It's not anything like the other disease. It's transferred by fleas.
Well, no, I'm saying being in public areas with each other, they got the plague. So everybody had to go into their houses in the plague. They actually quarantined in the Middle Ages.
Did it? Yeah.
So I'm telling you, it wasn't a viral contraction.
It's not.
It was carried by fleas.
Yes, it was. That's how the plague was carried by fleas on rats. And when these fleas jump from the rats to human beings, they bite you, and that's how you get the bacteria that causes the plague. But basically they declined not only because of the Black Death, but also because of syphilis. Yeah, that came around in the later Middle Ages and was pretty devastating as well. So it's a sexually transmitted disease.
No, I know, but is it a virus?
I think syphilis is a bacteria. Anyway, and despite the best efforts of movies and other things to tell you that people in the Middle Ages didn't invent things and they all lived in dirty houses and squalor and all of this, they actually invented a lot of new things we still have with us. So medieval people invented glasses, which is what this man right here is using to read. They weren't these kinds of glasses, but they used them as reading glasses, basically. So they had reading glasses. They had invented the iron plow, which metalworking became sophisticated enough that they bothered to invent plows with blades made of iron instead of wood or something else. Mostly because of the need to increase individual agricultural productivity. Because back in the Roman times, they just used slaves for everything. So using slavery, they didn't drive them to innovate agriculturally, because if they had a problem, the Romans basically were just like, throw more slaves at it until it goes away. But in the medieval times, when they relied on individual people working, earning an honest wage, suddenly you have to increase the efficiency of people who are working for a living, So that's how iron plows got invented. Clocks, mechanical clocks came around in the late 1400s. Previously they had clocks in the ancient world, but they were primarily sundials or other kinds of clocks. The mechanical, pendulum-based clocks, that kind of thing, came around in the late Middle Ages. Starting in, I think it was in Milan, where they installed the first clock tower, where people can see, from all over town can look up and see the time. That first got started in Milan in the late, I think, 1300s. They invented a lot of new stuff. And also the wheelbarrow was a medieval invention. Because when they were building all these castles and cathedrals and things, you need to carry a lot of these, rocks and things. So they're like, you know what, maybe if we made like a thing that you can push that can carry things, that would make it really easy to build things. So they invented the wheelbarrow. Legal systems changed. King Louis IX of France invented presumption of innocence. Previously, it was just kind of up to the judge whether he thought you were guilty or not. And the lawyer had to change the judge's mind. And then now, with presumption of innocence, you're presumed innocent until proven guilty. And we're going to talk about Louis IX later. He has his own slide. Medieval people knew the world was round, not flat. And the reason why they were able to observe this is because when they were sailing in boats, they noticed how things over the horizon disappeared as you sailed further and further away from them. So they determined that, maybe the world is round, because if I go over here, suddenly the land over there starts to get small and disappear. So the printing press, also another significant medieval invention. Redefined books. Previously books were hand-copied manuscripts copied by monks in monasteries, but now you can just start pumping out books, making books everywhere for everything, and everyone can read them. Well, not everyone. Books were still pretty expensive, but compared to before, books became very widespread. Mechanical navigation devices, complicated, weird things like I don't even know what an astrolabe is, but it's a complicated looking thing, so. All of these mechanical navigation tools were widespread among seafarers. Another thing is that medieval people only worked about 180 days out of the year. Especially agricultural workers like peasants, because you only have a certain amount of hours of the day where they can actually work because of the sun, and then of course they had every Sunday off, it was mandated. They had every holy day of obligation off, so they had Easter and Christmas and all these things off. And also a lot of the feast days for different saints and things, you had days off for all of those. So compared to modern people, especially Americans, medieval people, to us, it would look like they hardly ever worked. But when they do work pretty hard, I'm not going to deny that. But those days on which they do work, they did have to work pretty hard. But, medieval people didn't suffer from sedentary lifestyles, right? Because they gotta work, Unless, of course, they don't have any of that. Unless, of course, you're a monk, in which your lifestyle is completely different from any other medieval person. Well, they worked at other things, but most of their day was either spent in prayer or copying manuscripts. Medieval people were very social with each other. They knew basically everything about their neighbors, because most people never journeyed any more than maybe 10 or 20 miles away from where they were born. They lived in the same town their whole life. So, unless of course they were doing something like going on a pilgrimage or a crusade or something. Generally, people knew a lot about their neighbors and basically treated them like family. which I think is something that maybe, modern people could probably learn a lot about. Universities were founded in the Middle Ages. The first ever one basically was Bologna University in Italy, which was founded in 1088. Oxford was founded in 1096. Heidelberg University was founded in 1386, and there were a whole lot of other, basically all of the most famous old universities of Europe were founded in the Middle Ages. So now we need to talk about medieval government. So medieval kings are not these dictators. If you think about a medieval king, he's not an absolute monarch. He's bound by a lot of different things. He's bound by nobles, he's bound by the church, he's bound by the common people in a lot of cases. Depending on, it was dependent highly on the situation of how much power a king actually had, especially the King of France, who a lot of times was a very theoretical authority, like we mentioned earlier with feudalism. So, and if the king was misbehaving, the Pope would do things. He could excommunicate the king, place him under sanctions, all kinds of things, like we have nowadays, talking about placing Russia under sanctions and all of these things, it's really not that old of a practice, not that young of a practice, Countries would say something about how other countries were behaving back then,
United Nations.
Yeah, it was, Christendom was like a United Nations, really. So no medieval monarch had as much power and control as our own president, really. Since the early 20th century, the United States of America is more absolutist than any medieval kingdom, if you really think about it. The amount of taxes they levy on us, the amount of control that they place over us with laws and things would have seemed totalitarian to a medieval person. They would have been like, really? You just let that happen to you? What about revolt? So a monarch generally exercised soft power. Making decrees was usually a product of necessity, not of his whims. And as we'll talk about later, France had a lot of systems in place that restricted royal authority. So absolute monarchy is a product of the 17th century, which we're going to talk about in the next presentation, is France slowly moving from mixed monarchy into absolutism. And the king, he had a personal stake in the success of the government and the welfare of the people, because the economy of the country, his own success is highly dependent on the prosperity of the kingdom. So it was really in his best interest to ensure that all of the different estates were working in concert with each other. So it's kind of a bad art. So I hear a lot of people talk about this a lot. They're like, well, you see, in medieval times, people didn't live as good as us, So, I'm trying to think here. That living in the United States, the government has earned that power over you due to the increasing quality of life. They're like, nowadays we have so much, amazing stuff like light bulbs and televisions and all of this, So living in the United States, that's a privilege. And I'm like, well, I think liberty is pretty great, But, sometimes, the government oversteps its bounds. So, the president hasn't earned his power over me due to my quality of life. There was no President Thomas Alva Edison, no President Samuel Morse, no President Joseph Lister, no President Willis Carrier, and no President Alexander Graham Bell. All of these people were the great inventors of the 19th and 20th centuries, but they were never political figures. So it's not like they earned political power through the increasing quality of life brought by their inventions. So, and also, medieval king had a quasi-ecclesiastical role. He, depending on which king, he had a different role depending on who he was. But just as an example, the Holy Roman Emperor, during his coronation, was made into a deacon. And his job was to act as a deacon during a papal mass in Rome. So he would assist the Pope as a deacon during a papal mass if he was in Rome. Obviously, he couldn't be in Rome all the time, but when he was, that was his job. And of course, all of the kings of England, France, and also the emperor himself, again, were made into canons of major archbasilicas in Rome. So whenever they were present in Rome and they were attending a mass, they would go to that archbasilica and attend mass as a canon in the choir, actually, which is, you know, would be pretty unthinkable to most people these days. Yeah, so medieval kingship has a lot of traditions about it that just don't exist anymore, you know? So now we're going to talk about Louis IX, like I mentioned him earlier. So he lived from 25th of April 1214 to 25th of August 1270. He acceded to the throne of France in 1226 at the age of 12. However, this doesn't mean he was ruling the country when he was 12. His mother, Blanche of Castile, ruled for him as the regent. So eventually when he became old enough, then he took over the kingship. So he led the 7th and 8th Crusades, which were minor crusades. Really after the 4th one, they all dropped off, but he was big into crusading. So he went to North Africa, the Middle East, and Egypt. Unfortunately, during these crusades, he was captured and he was ransomed home. So ransoming was a medieval practice when if you were captured in war, you would be sold back to your country and given your freedom. However, he died of dysentery during the 8th Crusade. But one of his main contributions to France at home was, of course, the introduction of presumption of innocence, and also establishing provosts and bailiffs as law enforcement. Kind of like the police didn't exist in the Middle Ages. It was reliant on a lord's authority or the king's authority. But he basically invented the earliest precursor of what I could call the police in France with the provosts and the bailiffs. And also he endeavored to terminate private wars, which France basically had a lot of civil wars where basically lords would go to war with each other as individuals, with their own properties and retinues and things. So he tried to abolish that. He also abolished trials by ordeal, which a trial by ordeal is not really a trial. It's just we don't have enough evidence to convict you of a crime, so we're going to force you to do, like, I don't know, stand on top of hot coals or something. And it's just witchcraft kind of trial, really. But he abolished that, so that's his legacy. So now we need to talk about the Albigensian Crusade, which is not a Middle Eastern crusade. It was a crusade against heretics. So Catharism was a heresy that appeared in the 12th century in southern France. So Cathar beliefs were essentially that the world is a struggle between a good God and an evil God. They believed that the physical world was the domain of the evil God, so everything physical you had to reject it as fake, including civil authority, which got them into trouble. Because they disobeyed civil authority and they claimed that civil authority is the authority of the evil God or Satan, and therefore you have to disobey the government. They had a whole lot of other crazy beliefs, like sexual intercourse is evil because it continues the cycle of evil souls being trapped in evil bodies, because they believe that your body is also evil and illusion. It was crazy. These guys were nuts. And they also starved themselves and inflicting self-harm on themselves and all kinds of things. And also, they would kill people if they recovered from diseases. Because if you were sick and you were a Cathar and you recovered from being sick, they killed you because they regarded being alive as evil. Catharism was a death cult. So Languedoc, so Catharism originated in the Arc region, the southern France. And it was relatively urbanized compared to the north, because a lot of the population was concentrated in towns compared to the north of France, which was rural. So the Cathars used that to their advantage and spread relatively quickly. So basically, Catharism had kind of taken over in some towns in northern France, and they were called Albigensians because the first town to go over to Catharism was called Albi. So the Pope, Innocent III, declared a crusade against the Cathars to eliminate them because their religion was frankly dangerous. Also the King of France, Louis VIII, and of course the lords of France went to Languedoc and put down the revolt. And they seized the lands of the Cathars, and the suppression of the revolt, however, did have a large death toll. A lot of people died as a result of this. And the destruction of the Cathars, however, was basically inevitable. They didn't have the kind of military force that was needed to withstand the Knights, obviously.
You can move on.
Alright, sorry. And then regional powers and decentralization. So the parliaments of France were a court of appeals that existed in various regions of France. The most important one was Paris. And yes, this is the word where we get parliament from in English, but a parliament is a court, not a legislative body. So they provided regional authority to limit the power of the crown because they could refuse to publish royal edicts if they didn't like them. They evolved in the 13th century out of the King's Council of Advisors, and eventually during the Age of Absolutism, the power of the parliaments would be undermined more and more by the king. So this is a meeting of the Parliament of Paris. You know, we've got all these guys, sitting together in a room, I guess. So we're going to talk about the artistic and cultural accomplishments of medieval France. So in medieval France, the arts were flourishing. They were alive and well. Manuscript illumination. So in the pages of books, there were these complicated illustrations called illuminations, and they actually had gold in them. So they were called illuminations. And by the 1400s, they had become the main art form of medieval France. And then, of course, in literature, they had the chansons de geste, at least I think that's how you pronounce it, or the medieval chivalric poetry. So it was flourishing with works like the Song of Roland, which is about Roland, who was a companion of Charlemagne. And they were based on three main traditions. There was the Matter of France, or stories about Charlemagne, the Matter of Britain, or stories about King Arthur, and the Matter of Rome, so about stories about the ancient world, about like Troy or whatever, I don't know. So basically these poems became really popular, and they were read aloud and stuff, and a lot of them are still with us today. So then this is the medieval scriptorium. This is where monks would sit all day and copy books, word by word, hand by hand. It was kind of a tedious thing, but that's how copying books was done. And then this is a castle. Castles were a huge deal in France. They were the home of the Lord, and this is where he ruled his estate from. And this actually is a castle that's being built today. You're like, what? There's a castle being built today? Well, it's called Guédelon Castle, and it's being built in Burgundy. It's an archaeological experiment to discover methods with which castles were built. So it started in the 90s, and it's going to be completed by 2025. But this is just one example of what a typical 13th century French castle would have looked like.
And they're using all the old methods.
Yep, all of the old tools and things. No power tools, no machinery. They're building it exactly as medieval people would have done.
Makes them a century.
Well, no, only about 30 years.
Oh.
Guédelon's a relatively small one, though.
Oh.
It would have probably been the home of a minor lord. So now I'm going to talk about the 100 Years' War. So basically what happened is England, or Edward III of England, he had a claim on the throne of France. So he went to war with France to secure the throne of France. So he invaded France in Normandy, which is this place right across the English Channel. And the war went pretty well for England in the beginning, even though it was a relatively slow war, and it stopped and started off and on a bunch of times. And then France starts doing better throughout the second half of the war. So England eventually loses all of their holdings in France, because previously the King of England was not only the Duke of Normandy, but he also had Gascony, or Bordeaux, all the way down there. But he lost all of that to the French crown. And eventually they only kept a little piece called the Pale of Calais, all the way up here, which remained English for a little while longer. Joan of Arc, we'll talk about in a little bit, she helped the French win. The 100 Years' War was not actually 100 years, it was 116 years. But 100 Years' War sounds better than 116 Years' War. Burgundy allied with England. So Burgundy was a collection of states, fiefs, that existed in the 1400s to 1500s. That was kind of maybe a proto-country that was going to rebuild Lotharingia, but then it didn't. And we'll talk about them in a minute. England won the battles of Agincourt and Crecy with their superior archery. English were big into archery, and it helped them defeat the French knights, but ultimately even these two major victories couldn't help them secure the war. Heavily armored knights go into decline as a result of the 100 Years' War, with the introduction handguns and actual the longbows and other things, as well as the social institution of knighthood started to crumble. Cannons also were used for the first ever time in medieval warfare. So the early period of the war basically consisted of castle sieges and skirmishes, small little battles. And the armies were basically consisting of the feudal levies of the lords, the actual troops owned by the lords. And the kings relied on their vassals to provide forces. And this was all right because it relied on local forces to prepare moderate amounts of troops, which would later be assembled by the king into the main army. But it had the disadvantage of it being kind of ununified, all the different lords commanding their own forces, instead of being all unified under the king. So, and also the command structure and the quality of the troops varied massively between the different lords. So these are the troops of the early period. And of course they were dressed in the colorful heraldic clothing and all of this to distinguish each other from the English. English and the French had different coats of arms to distinguish each other. So the knights primarily wore a chainmail hauberk, which is just a giant shirt made out of chainmail. And the great helm, which is this helmet right here, which completely encloses the face.
How do they see?
Through the vision slits. They're actually big enough. I own one, actually. And the eye holes are actually big enough to where you have actually a decent field of view. And the footmen wore a mix of a padded gambeson, which is basically a quilted armor. It was relatively thick quilted armor. And an open-faced helmet called the chapeau de fer, which means the hat of iron in French, I guess. And that's what a chapeau de fer looks like. It was called a kettle hat in English and a Sturmhut in German. And this is Joan of Arc. So she was born in 1412 into a freeholding peasant family near Domremy, which is in northern France. In 1428, she had visions of Archangel Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine telling her to go and see King Charles VII. So, and then she convinced Charles to let her become a military commander. I don't know how this happened. It's nuts. But it happened, and that's really her greatest miracle, really. When she convinced Charles to let her lead an army to liberate the town of Orleans. She participated in many campaigns and battles against the English and the Burgundians. She was captured by the Burgundians and put on trial for heresy in a biased court in favor of the English and the Burgundians. She was burned at the stake in 1431. And however, the verdict was later overturned by the Inquisition when they reviewed the verdict and found out that the court was heavily biased in favor of the English and the Burgundians. So her cause for canonization was opened up, and after a couple centuries, she was finally declared a saint in 1920. That's hardly atypical for a saint. Causes for canonization have been a lot longer than hers, actually, so it'll take a while. So then the late period of the war. So by the later period of the war, professional armies began to dominate the battlefield as opposed to the feudal levies of the lords. So these were mercenaries who were hired directly by the crown to fight. The English longbowmen began to dominate the battlefield. Crécy and Agincourt, we mentioned those two, solidified the dominance of missile weapons over knights. Armor evolved from the coat of plates and, of course, the mail hauberk, like we mentioned earlier. So incomplete plate armor into complete plate armor made out of metal plates entirely. And also gunpowder warfare had been introduced into the armies. Cannons and also hand cannons as well began to start getting used to destroy castle walls. And ending the siege-based element of the war because castles had kind of dropped off once you have cannons that can smash right through castle walls. So these are some late period troops. We have, the knights had mostly transitioned into plate armor, into more and the footmen had changed into more modern helmet styles that kind of solidified the kind of later types of helmets. Like this helmet right here resembles a combed morion of the later centuries of the 16th and 17th centuries, and then this helmet here is a Burgonet helmet, which is a little bit more enclosing than the kettle hat. And knights dropped the shield while infantry picked them up. So knights stopped using shields because their armor had become good enough to where a shield was kind of redundant. And then large shields, such as this pavis here, started getting used by footmen, especially crossbowmen, who carried them as a kind of mobile cover from other missile weapons being used against them. So this is a medieval cannon. So this is Mons Meg, and she was a cannon cast in Flanders Castle in 1346. So she was one of the earliest heavy cannons of the bombard style, where it is literally just a big tube, and they have gunpowder in it and it fires like a cannonball. Those cannonballs there are huge, and they're made of stone, and they had to be individually chiseled to make them. Yeah, it was an expensive weapon. So then we're going to talk about Burgundy. So the Burgundian state was a collection of disparate territories in France and Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, that had been combined together by the rule of the Duke of Burgundy. So eventually, this collection of territories expanded throughout the 1400s, and it started to kind of look like Lotharingia was reforming itself, creating a border state between the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire. So the Burgundian state was not a unified country. These different counties and duchies and things were not united except in the person of the Duke of Burgundy. So this ambitious project got started with Philip the Bold, who was the first guy to seriously try and integrate his different holdings. So then he was succeeded by John the Fearless, Philip the Good, Charles the Bold, and then by the end of the century, Mary of Burgundy. And then the Habsburgs, Maximilian, the Emperor of Germany, married Mary of Burgundy and got the Burgundian inheritance for the Habsburgs. So Burgundy's idea, their national idea, their proto-national idea, was to rebuild Lotharingia. However, France reconquered a lot of things that Burgundy had taken from them. Switzerland had a whole series of wars against the Burgundians. It was a whole thing. I can't talk about it now. It was very complicated. And eventually, Charles the Bold got killed at the Battle of Nancy, and basically Burgundy's whole national aspirations ended there. And then, of course, Maximilian married Mary of Burgundy, which caused him to inherit Burgundy when she died. So this is the Cross of Burgundy, which is kind of a national symbol of Burgundy, and it's based on the Cross of St. Andrew. And the symbol there in the middle is the symbol of the Order of the Golden Fleece, which was created by Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, for his knights. But they used this symbol, and eventually the Spanish picked it up with the Burgundy when the Habsburgs inherited Burgundy, and then it became a symbol of the Spanish Empire, which is kind of funny how it comes from its Middle Francia origins. So this is a map of Burgundy, and as you can see, it's weird. It's weirdly shaped. It's basically the Netherlands, Belgium, and Middle France conglomerated, formed out of a bunch of different territories. But it was really just a collection of different fiefs. So these are the Dukes of Burgundy. So this is Philip the Bold. He's the one who got it all started. John the Fearless, Philip the Good, and finally Charles the Bold. And then Charles dies, and then Mary, who I think was his sister, inherited Burgundy, and then Maximilian inherited Burgundy, and that's when Burgundy's independent ambitions ended. So that's where we end, is France just won the 100 Years' War and has managed to maintain its independence from England. And in the coming centuries, France is going to manage to become a world power through its colonial endeavors, and also its wars of expansion eastward into the heart of Europe. And so presentations are every 2 weeks on Sundays. And the next presentation is about the Age of Absolutism, or when France's kings went for a little bit more than they could reach. That's just what I'm going to put it as. So, any questions?
This is like a basic question, but there are a lot of wars going on. Were all these wars for the purpose of gaining land? Mostly.
Essentially, yes. Most of these wars are either wars of expansion, wars of defense, or religious wars.
I thought they were mostly religious.
No. The Crusades were the main religious wars. Religious wars hardly ever happened between Catholic countries, you know, due to them all having the same religion.
All wars without land.
Except for the Cathars, they were a weird case.
Yeah, okay.
You know, this random death cult appears in France, and then suddenly everybody rushes in to destroy them. Which probably was a good thing, because eventually, you know, it's not like that movement had staying power. The whole movement was about reaching death. You know, if your whole goal is to die, you know, that's not really a movement that has a lot of staying power.
I wouldn't think, well, no, everybody died and then there would be nobody to.
So, alright, well, we're basically out of time. So, thank you for coming, everybody.
Thank you.